close the gap there. All right, so these are the study questions for Peter Singer for One Atmosphere. We'll talk about, we'll get to that in a minute. Everybody get one? Okay, so, and I want you to send this around. Okay, so before we get to Peter Singer, we want to wrap up just a little bit about Rawls. We were talking about Rawls. And so what was Rawls writing about? What was he concerned with? Justice? Yeah, okay, that's a good way of putting it. He was concerned with justice. What moral theory was Rawls into? Social contract theory, very good. Okay, so what was his famous idea? What was the twist that he put on social contract theory? Somebody besides Friday. Yeah, Carl? Connor. Cole. Yeah, Cole.
The veil of ignorance.
The veil of ignorance, yeah. So, the famous idea that Rawls had is the idea of the veil of ignorance. Alright, wait. That's it, right? Veil of ignorance. Okay, so what is the veil of ignorance? What's the idea there? Yeah, Megan?
That they don't know anything except for the rational.
Okay, let's start that over. Who are we talking about? Who's they?
The people are the veil of ignorance.
Okay, and why are they under the veil of ignorance? What are they doing back there?
Deciding like rules and
They're like making the social contract, right? Okay, so the twist that, remember he's a social contract theorist, but he's got a twist on it. Okay, so Megan, explain now.
that it removes all knowing except for that they're rational and self-interested.
Okay, so the people who are behind the veil, they don't know anything except for that they're rational and they're self-interested, right? So how's that supposed to help society to be more just? Yeah.
I mean, if they don't know who they are, they're just being rational for everyone.
Right. So they're trying to make this society that's going to be the best for everybody because they don't know who they are or what their place in that society is going to be. Okay, does that everybody kind of remember that? Okay. So when would you have inequalities in this society? When are inequalities considered to be permissible? Yeah.
When they provide advantages to the worst off.
When they provide advantages to the worst off person in society, right? Why would that be a feature of this veil of ignorance? How's the veil of ignorance supposed to guarantee that? That's what happens. Yeah, Cole?
Because the people under it don't know where they're gonna fall once the veil's lifted.
Yeah, and they might be that worst off person, right? So everybody's especially concerned, ideally, everybody's supposed to be concerned with the position of that worst off person because they're like, that might be me. So they're worried about what might happen to them in the worst case scenario, right? So the ideal society, or the just society, is designed so that everyone has the greatest possible amount of primary goods. Okay, you guys remember what primary goods are? Yeah, what are primary goods?
Like basic things,
Wow.
like,
Yeah,
Like rights, equality.
there are things like rights, liberties, income, healthcare, opportunities. They're the things that are useful no matter what you're doing in life, right? So remember, like the people who are behind the veil, they don't know what they like. They don't know what they like and what they don't like, so they don't know like what they're gonna consider good and what they're gonna consider bad when the veil's lifted. But they need the primary goods are the things that are gonna help them to get what they want and guarantee that they can get what they want no matter what it turns out that they want, okay? And the other thing about the just society is any inequalities that exist must provide advantages for the worst off. Okay? So the only way that inequality is permissible in this society is when it directly results in an advantage for the people at the bottom. Okay? So we talked a little bit about how that is different than a utilitarian point of view. Rawls saw his work as being like very different than the way that utilitarians view the world, right? A utilitarian might say that it's okay to have inequalities in society as long as it helps the majority of the people. If like the majority of the society or society as a whole is better off because there's inequalities, then that's okay, right? Rawls says no, inequalities specifically have to help the people at the very bottom or they're not good, you shouldn't have them, okay? Does everybody understand that difference? So Rawls is not a utilitarian, right? Okay, so Rawls was deeply influenced by Kant, okay? What was Kant all about? Rules, yeah, he liked rules, right? Yeah.
I'd say deontology.
Yeah, deontology, which is rules. What was his like big rule? His like central rule, yeah.
The categorical imperative.
Good, so what was the categorical imperative?
Just do what, only do what you would want everyone doing all the time.
Only do what you want everyone doing all the time. What was the other version of it? That's exactly right. And there was another version that was, it sounds a lot different, but it's kind of like he considered it another version of the same thing. Do you remember what that was? What are you never supposed to do with people? Treat them as means to an ends, right? People are always the ends in themselves. They're never a means of accomplishing the ends, right? So what do you think? So Kant was a big influence on Rawls. What do you think the connection might have been? What do you think the connection there was? What do you think the connection between Kant and Rawls is, if you had to like venture a guess? Yeah.
Is it that they were trying to make a system of rules that was, I guess, secular? You could say?
That's part of it. They both want to have like a secular basis. I mean, that's something that they had in common, but that's kind of true of almost any contemporary philosopher, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a little more broad than that's true, but it's a little more broad than what I'm looking for. All right, so, look, what was it about people that was like really important for Kant? Yeah. They're rational agents, right? And you guys can see that's like really important for Rawls as well, right? Okay, so that's kind of like part of the connection, right? So remember, Kant, he saw ethics as being about inflexible rules that you have to follow no matter what, right? And those rules are supposed to be based on logic or on pure reason, right? So for Kant, human beings have a special status as rational agents, and that special status always has to be respected. That's why people are so important according to Kant. It's that status as a rational agent that always needs to be respected, right? So Rawls, he's with Kant on both of those points, right? he sees reason as being the basis for morality in general, and specifically, he sees reason as being the basis for justice, okay? So, this is Kant's influence on Rawls. Human beings are autonomous, separate, rational agents. And so that's part of it, right? They both see human beings as being like these autonomous, these rational agents, and they're also autonomous. They're free to do what they want, and they're kind of separate from one another. So each one of them has to be treated as like an individual and as given the respect that they're due as individuals. Notice that Rawls, you never sacrifice somebody for the good of society, right? Somebody can only be at the bottom if they're better off at the bottom than they would be otherwise, right? If they would than they would be if nobody was at the bottom. You can't just sacrifice one person for the good of others. It's only if it's going to benefit them, right? So individuals are like really important, okay? And rationality is the basis for morality. Okay, so rationality morality all comes out of rationality and people's ability to reason. So they're a little bit different. Kant's obviously a deontologist. He was like the deontologist, whereas Rawls is a social contract theorist, but they had a lot in common. Kant definitely had a big impact on Rawls, right? So people who are behind the veil of ignorance, they may not know who they'll be when they choose the social institutions for their society, but they are rational. They know that. We know that about them. They're rational, and they know that about themselves. And they're going to use that rationality to try to set things up to maximize their own access to the primary goods, right? So there's also this basic respect for persons as individual agents who need to be allowed to have room to develop and pursue their own ends, and that's why liberty and rights, they're ranked among the primary goods. That's why those are so important, right? Because people are all individual, they all have their own projects that are important to them, right? So again, that's another reason, Rawls, he's opposed to utilitarianism, because a utilitarian, they might be asked to sacrifice, or they might ask somebody else to sacrifice themselves for the common good. And Rawls, just like Kant, he felt like a moral theory that properly respects people as individuals who are separate and different from one another. It's never going to allow people to treat themselves or to treat others as tools. Okay, does that all make sense? Does everybody feel like they understand that? Okay, so as I mentioned back at the start, Rawls, he is considered to be the most important political philosopher of the last couple hundred years, ever since Mill. But that's not to say that everybody agrees with him, right? A lot of people see him as important, not because he's right, but because his ideas sparked a lot of debate and a lot of discussion, right? So why do you think somebody might disagree with his ideas and say they're not good? Sure.
They might be a moral realist.
What's that?
They might be a realist.
Well, he's a moral realist.
Oh.
No, you're right, yeah. Somebody might be a moral realist, so they might not be a social contract theorist. No, you're right, yeah. No, he's not a moral realist, he's a social contract theorist. Okay, so somebody might be a moral realist. They might think that the whole idea of basing morality on a social contract is wrong. That's kind of one reason. Why else why might somebody be opposed to like the way he wants to set society up? Yeah, Max?
If the worst off people are like such a small amount, small minority,
Uh-huh.
then it might like be worse to like, I don't know, if it like makes most people lose out on something.
Okay, so that's kind of like, what you're saying is kind of like a utilitarian perspective. And that's right too, right? Some people say, why should we be so concerned? The very worst off people, that's not gonna be a lot of people, that's gonna be a small segment of society, right? So shouldn't we be concerned more with like the majority of the population instead of the people who are worst off? Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's a reason. Do you guys all understand that? Like, so I just wrote utilitarian up there, but it kind of means more broadly, like a lot of people are like, hey, we should be concerned with the majority of people and like making sure that the majority of people are better off and not so concerned with like that small group at the bottom. You know, there's other people kind of along this is kind of a more technical or more mathematical criticism, but some people say, look, if you're behind that veil, you wouldn't be that concerned with the person at the bottom, really, because what are the odds that that's going to be you, right? You'd be more concerned with like making sure that most people are better off, because your chances of being one of them are higher, right? But that's kind of like a technical criticism, right? What do you so? Do you think that Rawls, does he sound more like left or right politically? Left? Yeah, kind of. So how might somebody who's like a more right, kind of like more on the right, criticize him? Do you think? What would they not like about this setup? Yeah, cool.
I guess like the redistribution of goods from the top to the bottom.
Well, yeah, so there's supposed to be like this respect for property rights. So they're not just gonna like directly redistribute the goods, but there's a sense in which inequality is definitely supposed to be controlled, and it's only supposed to exist under certain circumstances. And so everything in society is supposed to be set up to make sure that inequality only exists under these carefully controlled circumstances. So it almost amounts to the same thing, right? So, so this has been criticized by Rawls. So Rawls, he's part of this general kind of Western philosophical tradition and political tradition, which is really focused on individual rights and individual freedoms, right? And he's been criticized both by people on the left who are like opposed to that whole framework, and people on the right who didn't think that he was taking this idea seriously enough, right? So he had a colleague at Harvard, Robert Nozick. Okay, we've talked about Nozick a little bit before. Do you guys remember what was his deal? What was his political theory? So Nozick's also been like enormously popular, right? Like a very influential author. And Nozick was a libertarian. Okay, and he had this theory that's based on the idea of entitlements. Okay, so the idea behind entitlements is when a person has acquired entitlement or ownership of some property or some goods in a fair and legal way, that stuff is theirs to do whatever they want with it. Okay? So how goods end up distributed, on the way Nozick looks at it, it doesn't matter how they end up distributed, right? The only thing that's important is that the mechanisms by which the entitlements are transferred is ethical, okay? So if the way that the entitlements are transferred is fair and ethical, and nobody's like constrained or being robbed or something, then the way that they end up, it doesn't matter, okay? So that put him at odds with Rawls. Rawls clearly believes in private property. He's an advocate of private property, but he thinks that one of the purposes, Rawls thinks, remember, one of the purposes of the state is to make sure that inequalities only exist in certain carefully constrained circumstances, okay? All right, so does everybody feel like you understand the disagreement? Okay, so if you imagine like Rawls and Nozick both like designing their perfect country, what do you think some of the big differences would be in like as far as like the institutions? What would be a lot different between those two countries? Yeah, Cole?
Rawls's government will be a lot more hands-on.
Yes, much more hands-on, right? They'll get interfere with life like much more. Life and the economy and just everything, right? That's a really good way of putting it, okay? And if you're gonna have a government that's hands-on in that way, is it usually gonna be bigger or smaller?
Bigger.
It's bigger, it's gonna be a lot more active, right? So what are you gonna need more of? What's that?
You need more.
Well, I mean that, you probably, but what else?
People in the government.
Well, yeah, and what do you need to have them? Because you gotta pay them, right? And you gotta have money for these projects.
Taxes.
Yeah, so taxes, obviously like Rawls is gonna have a lot more taxes, and the idea of taxation, there's kind of a different idea of taxation here, and what taxation is supposed to be doing, right? So to Nozick, taxes is like this kind of evil thing, and you want the absolute minimum possible government that you can have without having anarchy and without having like, you know, like Russia or China come over and take the country over, you know. And so you want taxes to be like at an absolute minimum. For Nozick, taxes, and for a lot of, sorry, not for Nozick, for Rawls, and for a lot of other political philosophers, taxes is a means of reducing inequality and ensuring that inequalities only exist within certain carefully constrained circumstances, right? Now you saw like Nagel, do you think Nagel's is to the left or right of Rawls? He's left of Rawls, right? So you kind of have this spectrum where you have like Nozick, Rawls is, and you know, here's the middle. Rawls is a little bit left of center, and then Nozick is like a lot to the left of Rawls. Or sorry, not Nozick, I mean Nagel. Nagel is a lot to the left of Rawls. Nagel wants to like just kind of equalize everything as much as possible. He wants to compensate people who are just kind of like not talented, right? Or they just don't kind of have the disposition to make money. And that's going to require a lot of taxation, right? To kind of level things off in that way, right? But these guys, they kind of see taxation as like this tool that you can use to even things out. Whereas for Nozick, taxes are just kind of like something that you use just to kind of keep anarchy from happening. All right, does everybody kind of understand that? All right, taxes are on my mind a lot right now. All right, so suppose, there's people farther left than, they're more to the left than Rawls is. What do you think they might not like about his ideas? Sure.
They don't think it's equal enough.
They don't think it's equal enough. I mean, that's a good idea, right? So, for instance, there's a Marxist philosopher, Kai Nielsen, right? And like he doesn't think, and a lot of Marxist philosophers, they think that Rawls is wrong, okay? What's important, it's not making sure that everybody's got the most primary goods possible. Equality is just important for its own sake. Okay, so the idea there is equality is important, and not just because it ensures social stability or whatever. Equality is like the most important thing, and if that's what society should be aiming at, it shouldn't be aiming at trying to make sure everybody's got the most possible primary goods. It should be trying to make sure everybody's got the same primary goods, even if that means they have less, right? Does everybody understand that? So, philosophers who think along these lines, they think that an egalitarian distribution is more important than people in society having lots of stuff, and that equality should be sought after, even if that means that sacrifices have to be made in terms of other primary good, the primary goods, including like freedoms and liberties and, income and things like that, right? So remember that if you have like two societies, you have like society A and society B, and in society B, everybody's got $50,000, say their net worth is $50,000, and in society A, this guy's got $1 billion, and this guy's got, 150,000, and this guy's got 75,000, all right? So small society, it's got 3 people, okay? Where would Rawls rather be? Where does Rawls assume you'd rather be? On the left, right? Does everybody understand that? Okay, where would Kai Nielsen rather be? In B, right? Okay, where would you guys rather be? Who'd rather be in A? Okay, who'd rather be in B? Nobody? Okay. Well, do you think there's any argument that you might make about why you'd rather? Can you see why anybody would rather be in B? Yeah.
Because then if you're in A, if you're in the bottom, you might think that's unfair.
Yeah, you might be pissed off if you're at the bottom. Yeah. Okay. So, Nielsen and other people who think like him, they criticize the placement of the individual and individual rights ahead of society as a whole and ahead of community-based values, all right? And a lot of philosophers who work in non-Western traditions, they criticize Rawls because of that. They're like, this focus on the individual, it's a very kind of Western focus, and you kind of got to get outside of your narrow kind of like European worldview. So that's a view, okay? That's one idea that's kind of opposed to Rawls, all right? Any questions on Rawls? No? All right. Let's talk about Singer. Okay, so there's one ground rule for this discussion, all right? If you don't believe in climate change, that's fine. There's other classes. It's good to be skeptical. It's good to question science, but there's other classes for that, all right? And we're just going to assume that there's climate change for the rest of this discussion, all right? If you really can't do that, just anytime you're talking about a resource that's running out and how it should be distributed, this stuff applies. So you can think about it in those terms, okay? All right, so we're going to do something a little different, talk about something a little different now. We're gonna look at the question of justice on an international scale in the context of a particular issue, in the context of climate change, all right? So the author of this paper is Peter Singer. Peter Singer was born in 1946, and he's still alive, okay? Anybody heard of Peter Singer before? I'm sure, assume, yeah. Anybody else? He's a well-known guy, he's pretty famous, all right? I bet you probably heard of him, you probably just didn't figure that out, or you probably just didn't recognize the name. If you kind of keep your ears open, you'll probably hear this name again after this class. Actually, do you guys know who that guy, what's the guy's name, Sam Bankman-Fried, who's on trial right now? Do you know what I'm talking about? He was one of Peter Singer's disciples, actually. So Peter Singer had, this is kind of an interesting way things kind of go wrong. Peter Singer had this idea that, he calls it effective altruism. He says, you know, you can go be like a charity worker or something like that, and that's good, right? But if you're really devoted to like utilitarian principles, you should try to do as much as you can, like generate as much like wealth as you can, and then you're in a position to help a lot more people, right? Like, who's giving more money to charity? Like, just like somebody who rings the bell for the Salvation Army, or like Bill Gates. Bill Gates, right? He's given way more, right? So the idea is, so this guy Sam Bankman-Fried was going to be like an animal rights worker, and he talked to Peter Singer, and Peter Singer's like, no, you have all these talents, you should make money, and then use all these billions of dollars you can make to change the world. But when he started making billions of dollars, he started using it to like take his, when he started having access to that kind of money, he started stealing it and using it for himself, right? So anyway, that's kind of a connection there to somebody who's in the news, all right? So anyway, Peter Singer is an Australian philosopher. He teaches at Princeton, and he's a utilitarian who's especially well known for his advocacy for international charity and for animal welfare. Okay, those are like the main things he's known for. And he's one of the most influential public intellectuals in the world. His views have had major impacts way outside of academics, like way outside of philosophy. People listen to what he has to say. And we're going to read 2 more of his papers in this course, and you're going to see that he is not afraid to challenge what many people consider to be common sense ideas about right and wrong. That's kind of why he's so famous. He really has powerful arguments against the moral status quo, okay? All right, so getting down to the topic of this paper, we should start by asking this, right? So deciding what to do about climate change, that might seem like it's first and foremost like a practical issue, okay? What do you need to do to go about accomplishing an important international goal without wrecking the global economy at the same time, right? Because you can't just tell everybody, just turn the factories off, stop driving cars. That's not going to work, right? Because you need factories, you need cars, okay? But, so there's this difficult practical question, right? But this is also a question of distributive justice, and it's a really tough question of distributive justice. So why do you think that might be? What's this got to do with distributive justice? Yeah, Cole?
Because not everyone, like in each part of the world, uses the same amount of.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? So who uses the most stuff?
The U.S.
The U.S. and
China.
yeah, China's catching up, but per capita they don't use as much. But like as a country, they're past us, right? But per capita, like the U.S. is way ahead of anybody, right? So how does that become a question of distributive justice? Like, what's the question here?
How do you, I guess, equal out, like, who uses, or,
So if you kill everybody that they have to make the same cuts, who's gonna get hurt worse, the worst?
US.
Well,
Or,
the US is gonna take a bigger, they may take a bigger cut in their, it depends on exactly how you do it, right? Yeah, the poor are gonna get hurt the worst, right? Because they have less to begin with. So if they have to make the same cuts that Americans do, we're gonna be uncomfortable, but we're still gonna be alive, and we're still gonna have power and stuff like that, right? All right, so another thing though is like, how do we get so rich? How did America and England and like Europe get so rich and so industrialized? Yeah, Ruby? They took, yeah, that's a big part of it. They just took stuff from other countries, right? Another thing is they polluted their way into there, right? They polluted the U.S. and Europe. Not only did they directly kind of just loot a lot of the stuff they have, they just polluted their way into being rich, right? We burned coal and we burned oil to get to where we are today, and now we're going to like China and we're going to India, and we're like, hey, we got to stop polluting, right? And they're kind of like, wait, we want to be rich too. It's our turn now, okay? All right. So on the one hand, we have a straightforward moral responsibility to preserve the atmosphere, all right? The atmosphere is what's called the common pool resource. All right? So a common pool resource is a resource that is not divided up among private owners so that it's held in common by the general public. Okay? And it's freely available for everyone to use. Okay, can you guys give me an example of a common pool resource besides the atmosphere? Yeah, Carly?
Water.
Well, yeah, like most water is like a common pool, like the ocean, like a lake is like a common pool resource. What's one that's within the U.S. that's like within our own country that's like a common pool resource to people in this country?
Lumber.
Well, sometimes. I mean, you can't just go cut down wood in a forest, though. Some places you can, some places you can't. So sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. Yeah.
Like all the roads.
Yeah, like roads. That's what I was thinking of. It's like roads. That's a good example. Sometimes lumber is, sometimes it's not. So it used to be like you could just go in the forest and like cut it down, right? Why do you think it's not like that anymore?
Because our forestry service takes in consideration of conservation and preservation.
It's exactly right. So some people think, because if they hadn't done that, what would have happened?
We would have a lot of endangered species of different trees, like the longleaf pine.
Yeah, they would have just cut all the trees down, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of people are kind of worried that the atmosphere is kind of at that point now, right? Okay. So when you have a common pool resource, people have to make a decision on how they're going to manage it, right? One choice is to have an organization like the government step in and take control of it, and that's what wound up happening with the forests, right? Another thing you can do is to leave it up to individual people using the resource to do the right thing and not abuse it, all right? So some cultures, they hold most things that they have as common pool resources. Some cultures are very collective, right? In our culture, the only things that are common pool resources are things that you can't put a fence around, all right? Like you can put a fence around a piece of farmland, but you can't put a fence around the ocean. That's why the ocean's still a common pool resource, right? And the atmosphere is still a common pool resource. But the atmosphere, it's definitely a common pool, it's definitely like an important resource because you take something out of it, you get the air you breathe out of it, right? But you put things into it as well. Okay, what do you put into the atmosphere?
CO2.
Oh, CO2, yeah. What do you put into it that, what does it serve as like a sink for? Pollution, that's exactly right. The atmosphere is a sink for pollution, right? It's a sink for industrial pollution, right? But the sink of the, just like the ocean is, right? But the capacity of the atmosphere to serve as a sink, it's not infinite, right? And it's a resource, because it's a resource that every human being uses, we need to come to an agreement about two questions of distributive justice, all right? So there's two questions here. How do you divide up that right to use that limited capacity as a sink, right, for your pollution? And two, how do you divide up the burden of cleaning up the mess that's already made, all right? So remember, distributive justice, it's not just about good things, like getting to use stuff, it's also about bad things, like cleaning up your messes, right? Okay. Now, in this case, in a certain sense, these come down to the same thing, okay? Because there's technologies out there that will remove pollution from the air, and for example, they'll store it underground. Okay? But a lot of what cleaning up the atmosphere really means is just not polluting so that natural cycles that the atmosphere has are not overwhelmed and they have time to work, right? Like the atmosphere does clean itself, but you gotta give it time to do that. It can't be constantly overwhelmed, okay? So the question of how to manage the atmosphere as a resource, it's already a complex moral issue because at the level of national and international policy, the requirement that you preserve the atmosphere, that you preserve this common pool resource, it's got to be balanced out against the desire not to detract too much from standards of living and from economic well-being. You have to take that into account when you try to decide what you're going to do, right? Okay, but it's made a lot more complicated when you get to the international level because of historical events and the history of how the current distribution of wealth in the world got to be the way that it is, all right? So, to summarize kind of like a complicated history, the rich nations got to be rich. They made their initial wealth by industrializing when there was very little concern for environmental damage, right? So Western Europe and the United States in particular, they got to go through the Industrial Revolution back in the 19th century when nobody really cared about the environment, right? And nobody knew what was going on, right? Now, they burned like massive amounts of coal and oil, and that's what got us to the point where we are today, okay? So now the developing world, you know, countries like Kenya and China and Nigeria and India, they want their turn to be fully industrialized and to become prosperous, right? But the problem is that to stop or even to delay climate disaster, we gotta make, everybody's gotta stop polluting. It can't just be the United States and Europe, okay? So the problem, this problem is really an acute one because although China and India, they're still pretty far behind like America and Germany in terms of how much each individual person, you know, per capita, how much pollution they're causing per person. They're catching up in those terms because they're starting to live better and better as they become wealthier and wealthier. And they've already far surpassed wealthier nations in terms of the total amount of pollution that they're causing, all right? So the number one polluters now, they are China and India, even though the average person there doesn't pollute as much, right? So the thing is, citizens of those countries, they can fairly question why they should have to accept strict pollution controls when doing so is gonna stop them from ever living like an American does, right? Like if we all of a sudden just put strict controls across the board, do you think that the Chinese are ever gonna catch up with us as far as how the average person lives? No. And they can reasonably say, like, how's that fair, right? Yeah? Okay. So the problem we face in trying to solve climate change are kind of like just other tragedies of the global commons, because it's more than just climate change. You have problems with like the oceans too, like the resources in the oceans. It's how we balance the need to stop pollution with the right of developing nations to lift themselves out of poverty, okay? So we have this third problem here, which is how to balance the need to stop pollution against the needs of developing nations. All right, so how do you balance the need to stop pollution against the needs of developing nations? All right? Okay, so does everybody kind of understand what the problem is here? Yeah? Okay, there any initial thoughts on like what can we do about this? Yeah.
I mean, like, just having, like, stricter laws, especially, like, here in America. A lot of Americans waste water, so, like, it just
Yeah.
runs straight out into, like, our sewage, like, gray water systems.
Sure, that's definitely a start, right? But like the problem is if we just have those laws so like when you have laws like that, they cost money, right, in the
Yeah.
economy, right? So, but if we only have laws like that in America, is that gonna like solve the problem?
No, it can also influence, like, other countries that are able to do that.
It might, but those other countries might also say, look, we wanna be rich. You got rich by not having laws like that, right? You got rich because you industrialized when there were no laws like that. We want to be rich too, so we're not going to do that. Right, so that's kind of a problem. I mean, what you're saying, I think you're definitely right. I think that you're 100% right, I just don't, I don't think it's going to solve the issue by itself for that reason. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So during the industrialization and the pollution, did we have a grasp of how detrimental it was to the atmosphere at that time?
Not really. I mean, okay, so let me say this, like when it started, no. But it is true that we've kept polluting like way after we knew better, right? Like nobody, like they've known at least since the 90s that this was bad, and nobody really did anything about it until like very recently. And even now we're not doing a lot. We're not doing what we need to do. You know, another thing is like even leaving aside like questions about like the greenhouse effect and stuff like that. Like, yeah, you know, that's all, we don't, you know, you can argue about that. Maybe it doesn't work exactly how we think it works or whatever. There's no question that pollution is bad. People have known that for a long time. That's why life expectancy in cities used to be so much shorter than it was in the country, right? And like the people who like own these factories and stuff, they knew that, but they weren't gonna stop because they were making money off of it, right? So, yeah. For most of the history, no, they didn't really know how much impact they were having on a global scale, no. Yeah. So what was that your question?
My question is, how can we equate to us getting rich if we had no effects or we had no knowledge of the true effects of that?
Okay, good. Yeah, so that's a consideration, right? Is like maybe we're not necessarily guilty, like, but even if you leave that out of it, right? You know, even if we didn't get rich in like an underhanded way, we still got rich by doing that, right? And so now China's like, well, now it's our turn, right? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, but I mean, now that you know the full, like, the weight of what happens when you
Yeah.
do that, why would you wanna continue and put everyone on this planet at risk?
Well, I mean, so that's a good question, right? But like, what are we gonna do? What can you do about it in a way that you think is gonna be like acceptable to like the Chinese or the Indians or the Nigerians, right? Because look, if you were a citizen of like Botswana, right? Would you take that as like, and so like Americans are over here and they're rich and they're like, they've been polluting for like 200 years, and now or like 150 years, and now they're like, oh, now everybody's gonna stop polluting, right? And you're like, yeah, but we're broke. We need to pollute. And the Americans are like, yeah, sorry, we didn't know how much damage we were causing, so it's okay. But you got to stop now, right? Are you likely to take that as being?
In cases like that, I believe that there should be international institutions to where we
Yeah.
redistribute our wealth.
Okay, well that would definitely fix the problem. Do you think that's gonna happen?
Not to the capacity that it needs to happen.
So one thing is, that's a very radical solution, right? Like a lot of people are not gonna be okay with that. You're gonna redistribute everything and just level everything.
Well, not necessarily level everything, but help countries who need that help.
Oh, yeah, okay, like help countries who need, yeah, so that's a solution, but like, that's definitely, I think that's exactly right. There's gotta be an element of that, right? Like, if you're gonna ask these countries to stop polluting, you gotta help them, right? But I think that's definitely, whatever the solution is, it's gonna definitely involve that, right? But the details of how you're gonna work that out are like really complicated, right? Because how are you gonna help them exactly, right? Well, to help them, you need money, right? And the more we cut back, the less and less money we have. And, you get into these questions of like, how much money do we have to give to India or China or Botswana or Nigeria at this point, right? So, I mean, like, the solution, it's gotta involve that, it's gotta involve what Michaela was saying, but, it's, like, the details of like working that out are hard, right? And like, who's, like, how do you parcel out the responsibility for helping these countries, right? That's hard too.
Well, I mean, obviously, most of it would fall on the back of the United States.
But most of it would, but like, do you think the US is just gonna accept that?
No.
No. But I mean, maybe in
the ethical world.
in an ethical world, yeah, I think that you're right, but a lot of it is gonna fall, but some of it's gonna fall on like England,
Right.
Canada, and Australia, and Japan, South Africa, but like these countries, they're gonna argue about how do you decide exactly who's responsible for paying what, right? Yeah, was there another hand up? Yeah, so these are tough issues, right? And I think that you guys are definitely right, but like I said, the details are tough. Okay, so Singer wrote this book back in 2002, but this issue, it definitely hasn't died in the last 20 years, right? So in 2022, there was this thing called the COP27, the 27th Annual International Meeting on Climate Change, and it was held in Egypt. And a couple of typical headlines from that event were, at COP27, developing nations have a message for polluters, pay up. And that was the New York Times. And the headline from Reuters was COP27, loss and damage compensations, who should pay? All right? Okay, so let's talk about it's kind of a background thing here before we get into the philosophical issues. Who's heard of the Kyoto Protocol? Who's heard of that? It's kinda, yeah, you've heard the name. Yeah. So, that was an international treaty that was drawn up in 1997, okay? So the Kyoto Protocol is a treaty from 1997. Okay? And the Kyoto Protocol committed nations to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. All right? So the first version of that treaty, it ended in 2012, and it involved 190 nations. That's almost every country in the world was involved in the first iteration, okay? The newer extension was adopted in 2012. 144 countries signed it. So what does that tell you?
Less countries are.
Yeah, a bunch of them quit, right? Yeah. So the concept is, the idea behind the Kyoto Protocol was that these nations are working together towards a common goal, but the idea was that each of them was going to do so in a different way that was appropriate to their level of development, their economy, and their capacity to absorb changes. Yeah, Elon?
How many countries signed it?
190. And then it went down to 144 in the second one. Yeah. So the kind of the guiding principle of the Kyoto Protocol was common goal, different responsibilities. Okay? So the original treaty in 1997, it had binding commitments for only 36 nations out of that 190. So only 36 out of 190 actually really had to do anything. And the newer one, it's only 37 out of 144, all right? So the underlying philosophy behind the Kyoto Protocol was that every nation has the right to economic development, and the developed nations have been by far the heaviest polluters, all right? And so they carry the responsibility for fixing the mess that they made, all right? So the thing is, it became apparent that, you know, on some ideas behind distributive justice, that is the fair way to do things, but it's not actually going to get you anywhere. It's not actually going to fix this problem, all right? So the first run of that treaty was from 1997 to 2012. Those 36 countries that had binding commitments, they all met their goals. All of them met their commitments, but the thing is, they did that by buying the right to pollute from smaller countries who didn't have as much industrial activity. So like the US would go to like Angola and say, you know, you have this much right to pollute, you're not using it, we want to buy it from you. We just give them money and get their rights, okay? So meanwhile, so all 36 of those countries met their goals by doing that. In the meantime, do you think total global emissions, did they go up or go down? They went up by 1/3, okay? So because these poor nations were increasing economically as their populations increased, right? So the United States signed that treaty in 1997 when Clinton was president, but it was never ratified, right? And the next president, George G.W. Bush, he pretty much kind of summed up the prevailing attitude. He said Americans shouldn't have to make any sacrifices that the rest of the world isn't making, all right? And that was not just like, we all know he was kind of like a fringe Republican at the time. Now he looks very moderate compared to like most Republicans now, okay? But he was kind of like an extreme person in his day, all right? And that wasn't just like a French Republican attitude. When the Kyoto Protocol went to Senate, the Senate was defeated 95-0, okay? And you think about how hard it is to get the Senate to agree on anything, they unanimously defeated the Kyoto Protocol. Nobody voted for it, all right? So other major nations, Russia and Canada, they also dropped out not long after that. And they said the same thing. They said the treaty hurts us economically, right? So as of last year, the only countries who are still, those 144 who are still in the treaty that are bound to do anything is Australia, Kazakhstan, and all the countries in Europe west of Russia, right? They're the only people who have to actually do anything under that treaty, right? All of South and Central America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, except Japan, are in the treaty, but they have no obligation under the treaty at all. They don't have to do anything, right? So, if you think for a moment about the relative balance of wealth between those countries that are bound by the treaty to do something and those that are not bound to do anything by the treaty, and more importantly, how that distribution got so lopsided, you kind of have an idea why that treaty is set up the way it is, but there's kind of this question of whether that attitude is going to be helpful at all in a practical sense. All right, so are there any questions about the Kyoto Protocol? Yeah,
This isn't really a question about like Kyoto
sure.
our protocol, but like earlier in our discussion, we were talking about like, you know, whose like burden and everything it is.
Yeah.
Like why didn't like our government step in more during like our industrial revolution if they kind of knew about the concerns of pollution?
Well, I mean, who does the government generally, who is the government generally most answerable to?
I guess us.
Well, kind of, but like,
People making money.
people making money, yeah. Like, so like, the government's very easily influenced by corporations and things like that more than it is like the common person. So like a lot of people are like, yeah, you know, people are getting sick from all this pollution like in cities, and you know, like the water's not healthy to drink and things like that. But you know, it takes a long time for changes like that to be made, especially when the people who are bringing that evidence forward are like, you know, relatively like powerless, and the people who are doing the polluting and benefiting from the polluting are like really kind of important to rich people, right? Yeah.
So I guess I have a question, like, isn't a lot of the pollution caused by these corporations?
What's that?
Isn't a lot of the pollution caused by corporations and what they,
I mean, like at some level, it's almost all caused by
Yeah.
corporations, right? Yeah.
so if you crack down on one country, couldn't these corporations just up and move to another country?
Well,
that doesn't
some of,
have
I
the
mean,
same
that,
rights?
yeah, so that's one thing that's going on, right? So like why do you think like a lot of manufacturing gets displaced overseas, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like, how is just like cracking down on one country actually gonna
Well,
help anything?
Well, I mean, so that's the big problem with this, right? Is no one country can solve it themselves, right? So that's why this is so hard, is because no one country can solve this, right? It takes the whole world, but you got to get the whole world to agree on some kind of theory of some kind of guiding principle of distributive justice that's going to help you to do this. And like, you can't even get people in like one town to agree on anything, right? Yeah.
But like, wouldn't like the best thing for them to like us to try to get everyone to agree would be like education?
Yeah,
On
yeah.
like how a lot of like nonprofits like they go forward and like a lot of it is like about education and restoration.
Well, that's definitely got to play a role. You got to educate people to make them care, right? But there's got to be some kind of regulation, or like just all the education that you're going to do is not, because not everybody's going to listen to that, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, if you don't, you know, you can educate people on how to treat like a common pool resource, but if you don't regulate it, it's, you know, history's kind of shown if you don't regulate common pool resources, they're just going to get trashed, right? Yeah. But I mean, education like plays a role. That's why there are so many like nonprofits. I think that close to mine too, so I think that's why there are so many like nonprofits and stuff in that sectors, because everybody does see that as like playing a big role, right? But even there's a lot of arguments between the nonprofits as far as like what's important, right? And like where the focus should be and like where the money should be. All right, so we have this problem of like distributive justice, right? And a really simple solution would be for every country in the world to take the same steps and to make the same cutbacks and to make the same sacrifices. And that might work. One way to do that would be to like get your best scientists to get together and figure out what a sustainable level of emission would be around over the whole world. And then you would divide that by the world's population to figure out how much each person you could emit per person. And then you would divide that up around the world based on the world's population of that country. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? Okay, so like, I'm just gonna totally make up a number here. Like, say they determine that you can emit, the whole world can emit like 1 billion tons of emissions, right? Like that, I'm just totally making that number up, but let's say like 1 billion tons, right? That means every person in the world would be able to emit about 1/8 of a ton, right? So like the US, how many people are in America? Does anybody know that?
170 million?
What's that?
I don't know.
I think that's a real
130
old number. I
million.
think it's like 330. It's
Yeah.
about 330, right? So there's about 330 million people in the US. So like the US would get the right to emit about 45 million tons, something like that, right? Does everybody kind of follow that? Okay. All right. So there's this simple solution. Figure out the sustainable global level of pollution. Divide by the world's population. Assign to each nation a right to pollute based on their population. All right? So that's a solution, okay? It's a really easy, it's a very easy solution, all right? Does that seem fair?
I guess it could be, but it also like depends on like the circumstances of the people that live in the country. Like for me, like I know I emit a lot more than let's say
Yeah.
like you might live here in Statesboro, but like I'm a commuter student.
I
So
am a
it could be-
computer professor.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, like it
No, I
sounds,
don't-
I'm just
I
like,
don't like living in the dorms.
I mean like, I'm just saying like if you like lived in like Statesboro, like locally in Statesboro.
Yeah, I live in Statesboro.
Like I don't, it takes me like 45 minutes to
Okay,
get here.
sure, yeah.
So like, I know I'd be like polluting more, so this would be kind of like hard to like gauge.
Well, I mean, so the idea is like America would get the right to emit like 50 million tons, right? And China would get the right to emit like 150 million tons. And India would get the right to emit like 175 million. And like Switzerland would get like 10 million, right? And however the country decides that they're gonna regulate that, that's up to them. Like their government, right? That's how that's supposed to work.
Like, would that like include like also like agriculture as
Yeah,
well?
yeah, well, it's gotta include everything, right? So like, countries who are agrarian, they're gonna have to assign like a bigger share of that to, agriculture, but agriculture's like not really by and large like the big polluter, it's industry, you know? All right, guys, so think about this, think about whether this is fair and what some of the drawbacks might be. I'm gonna give you back your quizzes, okay, your last quizzes that you took. On your way out, so let me say one thing really quick about this. If you have work, like an old exam, or any old quizzes or anything that you want, I have them in my office. If you don't get them back by 9 April, I'm gonna throw them out, okay? So if you want like your first exam or whatever, you gotta get it before then, all right? Okay, so on your way out, these are the study guides to the next two things we're gonna talk about. On Tuesday, obviously we gotta finish this. We got quite a bit of this to go, but we're gonna start talking about free will So you may want to read that thing by Nagel on free will. It's pretty easy read. It's about 8 pages, okay? All right, but a lot of that we're going to cover in lecture. Okay. Eddie. Logan. Gabby. Oh, Eddie. Yeah. Okay. Eli. Once you have it, you can go. Okay.